Well, I have to tell you that historians suffer from an incurable malady. They have a propensity for trying to structure time. And we call that in the profession periodization, making things into separate units of time, periods, eras, ages. So, for example, you have the Gilded Age of the 1920s in America, or the Depression era, or the post-war era. And that's a very common thing for historians. I think most people like to study history that way. Jewish history in America is no different. We have a number of periods that we talk about. We talk about, for example, the pre-colonial period, or the colonial period, which lasted up until 1776. And then we talk about the early national period, or the period of Sephardic dominance, which lasted until about 1840 or so. Sephardic means that these were Jews who came originally from either Spain or Portugal, or their descendants. And they had a very particular way of conducting their communities, of speaking to each other, of relating to other Jews around the world, and of course of doing their synagogue worship in a very particular way. The normal periodization of American Jewish history is based on national origin. That is to say, Sephardic, and then from 1840 on, Germanic or Northern European, and Eastern European, and then from about 1900 or 1910, we began to talk about Eastern European Jews, and beginning to take control of the community, and then after World War II, an American period, where there's scant immigration, but there are a lot of people who are more or less homogeneous. Now, there are other ways to think about periodization, too. For example, you could talk about how the community is structured, how its institutions work, or you could talk about where people lived. But the normal way is to talk about national origin. There was no scientific count of how many Jews there were in North America. So all we have are estimates. This is a consequence of the way our government works, and particularly of the First Amendment, the separation of church and state. We take a census in America every 10 years. The first one was in 1790. And that tells us a lot about how America is populated. On the 7th year of the cycle, that is, let's say in 1947 or 1957, we test run the census. And in 1947, they decided to ask a question about religion. The Canadians do this all the time, because they don't have the same separation issues, but we do. And there was such a blowback and such a hue and cry about the census that they took it out in the 1950 census, and it's never been asked ever since. So what can we say about the Jews, the Jewish population of early America? Well, we know that there were about 2,500 in the colonies up until independence. They were spread in 6 communities, as we've said before, including Montreal. After independence, the population grew slowly, and by about 1825 or so, we think that there were around 15,000 people in North America who said they were Jewish. That number tripled, and then some, by 1850, or 1840, excuse me. And by 1840, there were about 50,000, and by 1860, there may have been around 150,000. What had happened? Well, there were some major upheavals in Europe. Jews, of course, lived in southern Germany, in Bavaria and Hesse and some of the other states of Germany. There were, during the 1830s and 40s, significant agricultural failures. You know about the Irish potato famine, but there was an equivalent drought and famine in southern Germany, and that made it very difficult to survive economically. But something else happened as well. The factory system. Up until around 1840 or so, if you wanted to produce garments, let's say shirts, what you did was you sent somebody down to the marketplace on either Monday or Thursday, which were the market days, and you said to them, go and buy cloth, thread, needles, buttons, whatever you need. Bring them back to the house, and while you're gone, we will shove all the furniture in the main room aside, and we'll make it into a workroom for the entire family. And when you get back, we'll all sew shirts. Now that put a lot of people to work. It had some deficits. First of all, it was enormously slow, and the quality of the shirts depended on the skill of the seamstress or sewer, and they couldn't make a lot of different sizes. They made big and they made small. And then when you bought the shirt, after somebody took it back to the marketplace, you went to another tailor and you said, how about altering it so it fits me better? Well, along comes the factory. And the factory takes the production out of the house. It puts it into a more mechanized system where shirts can be made cheaper, faster, with better quality, and with fewer workers. And that's the key. A lot of people who were otherwise employed in what we call the cottage system of production were put out of work. And so there was considerable unemployment at the same time that there was this agricultural devastation. There was also political dissatisfaction. In 1848 there were revolutions in France and Germany and Austria, but they didn't last very long, and they were probably not a major cause of emigration from Central and Western Europe. The Jews who came to America were really looking for economic opportunity, but they didn't neglect the fact that America was also a land of freedom, and that the ideals of the French Revolution were being played out on the Potomac River, on the Hudson River, on the Ohio River, and elsewhere in this country. So there was large-scale emigration from Germany, both Jews and Christians. I live in a section of South Texas where there are dozens of towns with Germanic names because the Germans came to this area and they founded communities. Jews settled in those same communities because they found people who were congenial and with whom they could do business, with whom they had a cultural connection, and so on. Jews also, during this period, settled west of the Appalachians. They went into an area called the Northwest Territory. The Northwest Territory has nothing to do with Seattle or Boise, Idaho, or Butte, Montana. The Northwest Territory was 5 states, or eventually 5 states, west of the Appalachians, west of Pennsylvania: Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And the Northwest Ordinance, which was adopted about the same time as the Constitution, provided that there would be no religious discrimination in this territory. So this is really the Great Lakes, and the Jews settled out there en masse, a number of new communities. Some went south as far as Texas and Alabama, Georgia. Nobody went to Florida because Florida was still foreign territory. And some, of course, decided to try their fortune in the far west. And after gold was discovered in California in 1848, a flood of Jewish emigrants went across the country on the great trails, the Chisholm Trail and the Butterworth Mail Trail and so on, to see about what they could maybe make a fortune in California. There were new Jewish communities during this time. Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Chicago, New Orleans, and then from New Orleans moving up the Mississippi Valley to Natchez and St. Louis and Minneapolis. But my favorite community, and it was actually a favorite community of the German Jewish immigrants, was Cincinnati, Ohio. Cincinnati, Ohio was a place that was settled by Germans, German Catholics primarily. Jews liked it. Now, what made Cincinnati so attractive? Well, there was a river that comes down just east of Cincinnati called the Little Miami River. And in the spring, there's a lot of water in that river, but there is much more water in the Ohio River into which it spills. And when the Ohio River reached flood stage, the Little Miami backed up. And what it did was it deposited fresh soil, topsoil, onto the agricultural areas. So then when the water went down, you could grow just about anything in those fields. And they did. They grew barley, and they grew corn especially. And what do you do with barley and corn? Well, you do two things. One is you make beer or whiskey. They were good at that. They also made or fed pigs. And Cincinnati got a rather unwelcome nickname, Porkopolis. They prefer to call it the Queen City of the West. The population of Cincinnati grew rapidly, and the Jewish population grew accordingly. And so you have a large center of Jewish population growing up in Cincinnati in the 1830s and 40s. Several congregations of Jews there, and an industry, which we'll talk about later, but let me just give you a hint, ready-to-wear clothing. Lots of shoes, pants, shirts, other kinds of clothing were made in Jewish factories in Cincinnati. Beyond the Mississippi River, Jews also settled in other communities. In Omaha, Denver, Seattle, California. The only places where they didn't settle were in Florida, a little bit in Arizona and New Mexico, but basically by the time that we get to the Civil War, almost all of the major communities that we still recognize as big Jewish communities today had been founded. In each community, the first thing they did was found a cemetery. In my community of Corpus Christi, Jeanette Hirsch died in 1873. That was a little bit later, but there was no cemetery. And they had to transport her body by ox cart or mule cart 3 days to Gonzales, where there was the nearest Jewish cemetery. Eventually we got a cemetery. They founded synagogues, of course, and they founded fraternal organizations. One of the most significant of those was the Independent Order of Bene Brith, which was founded by 12 German Jews in New York City in 1843. The leader was a man named Henry Jones. His name wasn't Henry Jones. His name was Heinrich Jonas. He was a German Jew. The needs of the immigrants were social, cultural, support, philanthropic support, companionship, all kinds of needs that any new person needs in a community. Now, in America, this was a period of rampant competition in the economy. Nobody coordinated anything, and the Jewish community followed suit. And so there was a great duplication of services. People founded new institutions right and left, even if they duplicated other services. but the synagogue played a major role. The Sephardic style, the style that had been brought over by these Spanish and Portuguese early settlers, was no longer adequate. There were too many Jews in the major cities now for one synagogue to handle all of them and all of their needs. And some of them wanted a ritual that was more like the experience they had had in Northern Europe. So in 1825, we have the second synagogue in America in a city, the second synagogue in a city established in New York City, Bene, which is a synagogue devoted to Jews from a Germanic background. Very shortly thereafter, in 1828, Anshe Chesed was founded, and in 1845, Sharei Tefillah, which served English and Dutch Jews. So you have these different communities establishing synagogues where they had friends and relatives and could talk to each other and could pray in a language and in a style that they were accustomed to. These synagogues followed an American value, namely the consent of the governed. And so if the governed, that is the members of the synagogue, didn't like what was going on, they did exactly what the Declaration of Independence said they could do, and that is they went elsewhere. The right, they demanded the right to worship in their own style, and nobody could dictate the ritual, as was the case in Europe. By 1840, there were as many as 14 synagogues in New York City. Almost every Jewish community had its own place of worship, but there was no overall communication or coordination. No authority could tell anybody what to do. So there was a great deal of independence, liberty, and individualism. There were a few functionaries. We've mentioned that the first ordained rabbi in America was either S.M. Isaacs in 1839 or Abraham Rice in Baltimore in 1840. Rice left the rabbinate within about 9 years and went into the real estate business. Jews in the major cities could strive to maintain their traditions. They had enough people so that they could keep kosher, they could have a bakery, they could have a butcher shop, they could have other kinds of services. But in many smaller communities, in fact in virtually all smaller communities, that was not a possibility. So they needed a form of Judaism that would simultaneously preserve their identity and yet at the same time enable them to be comfortable in this new American society. And that meant that they needed a kind of Judaism which could adapt, which was fluid, and which was congenial to change. And so a form called Reform Judaism, it's never reformed, but Reform Judaism, became the primary form of Jewish religion in 19th century America. Reform Judaism had originated in Germany around 1810 or 11, but with limited success because the Orthodox establishment was able to insist that the community functionaries, namely the police, would probably close down these upstart congregations. But in America, Reform Judaism fit perfectly for most of the immigrants. It focused on the maintenance of basic principles and ideals, but it also allowed for change to meet new circumstances. And so, in 1824, we find the first glimmer of reform in America in Charleston, South Carolina, the Reformed Society of Israelites, and a rabbi who was not a rabbi, but he functioned as a rabbi, named Isaac Harvey. He was a journalist and a playwright, tried to lead this group. It lasted for 8 years, but in 1832 it failed, and the congregation went back to its previous style of Sephardic ritual. Now, There were three giant leaders who emerged from this period. And let me tell you just a little bit about each one of them. The first is a man named Isaac Liser. Liser was born in Germany in 1809, and he moved eventually to Philadelphia, where he died in 1868. He was not an ordained rabbi. He was a chazan, a cantor or lay leader. But he was the leader of the more conservative branch of American Jews who were not Orthodox. He was what you might call conservative today. What were the innovations that he established? Listen to this list. It's quite impressive. Preaching in English. Up until that point, sermons had been given in Yiddish or in Ladino or Portuguese or some other language. He established English sermons. He translated a number of books, including the Bible. He established the first Jewish parochial school, the first Jewish seminary. Maimonides College in 1855 was something he worked at. The first Jewish Publication Society to make available books of Jewish interest to the new and growing American Jewish population. He published a number of papers. One of them was called the Occident and the American Jewish Advocate, and these papers were circulated all over the country. He also was a fervent defender of the rights of minorities, and he even spoke out strongly on the rights of Seventh-day Adventists, who were Sabbath observers and, like Jews, felt disprivileged because they were forced to close because of Sunday blue laws. They had to close 2 days a week. That put them at an economic disadvantage. Liser was a middle-of-the-road, conservative, but very important founder of American Jewish institutions. And then there was David Einhorn. Einhorn was born in 1809, also in Germany. He died in 1879 in New York City. He was an ordained rabbi. And he spent 6 years in Baltimore, Maryland, until 1861. But he was a firebrand. And he had extreme views against slavery. Well, Baltimore was a southern city. That didn't go over very well with his neighbors. In 1861, in April, he preached a sermon called The War on Amalek. He identified the southern states who were now seceding from the Union as Amalek, an evil empire, as Ronald Reagan might have said. This provoked a mob riot, and he fled to Philadelphia just ahead of a mob that was going to tar and feather him. He championed the more radical side of religious change of liberal Judaism, and he insisted that all that was necessary to retain were the moral teachings, that the rituals, the things like keeping kosher, wearing certain garb, and so on, were no longer necessary. Finally, another man born at the same time in 1809, but now in the area called Moravia, which is today the Czech Republic, was Isaac Mayer Wise, and he died in Cincinnati in 1900. He was perhaps the most important Jew in America during the 19th century. He was a middle ground reformer, somebody who didn't take extreme positions. He tried to think of union rather than the issue of slavery. He would not preach about slavery. He came originally in 1846 to Albany, New York, and he was there for about 4 years. He instituted a number of changes in the synagogue in Albany. Mixed seating, for example, new prayers, the use of an organ during worship, which was forbidden by Orthodox Judaism. He had one problem. He insisted that as the rabbi, he had the sole right to control what went on during worship. And the lay leadership, especially in the form of the congregational president, said, no, this is a collaborative venture, and you have to consult us. And on one occasion, Wise and the president got into a fistfight on the pulpit over an issue. Wise was not a very tall man. He was about 5'4", maybe 5'5", and predictably he lost the fight. And eventually he left Albany and decided he would go somewhere else. He had two options. One was Charleston, South Carolina. Remember, that was the original Reformed congregation. He thought maybe that was a good idea. Fortunately, he didn't choose that. He chose Cincinnati. And he made Cincinnati the home of Reformed Jewish practice, ideals, training, and the center of Reformed Judaism in America for a long time. His goal was to create a unified and authoritative structure for all American Jews. And so in 1855, Wise convened a conference of rabbis in Cleveland to try to find a way that everybody would get along together. It failed because some of the rabbis insisted that the Talmud, the biblical commentary called the Talmud, which dates from about 500 or 600 of the Common Era, had binding authority. Others said no, that it did not, and they couldn't agree. His prayer book, Minhag America, became the root of the Union prayer book, which eventually became the prayer book of Reformed Judaism. During the Civil War, as I said, Wise thought that union was more important than slavery. And so he established institutions, all of which were intended to unify. In 1873, he created the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. His idea was all congregations would be together. Didn't work. 2 years later, in 1875, the Hebrew Union College, and in 1883, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, all of them with the effort to develop a common consciousness of American Jewish identity together. And he pushed these ideas through two newspapers, one in English, the American Israelite, which is still published, and one in German, Die Deborah, which is no longer published. But they were national papers, and he had people in various communities all over the country sending him little tidbits of information that he could put into the newspaper, so you would know what happened in Shreveport, Louisiana, and what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and what happened in Atlanta, and so on. So we have the emergence during the 1830s and 40s of a Jewish community which is now really a substantial community, numbering in the tens of thousands. And we'll continue with that period during our next talk.